But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In the vast realm of human innovation, where ingenuity lights up the corners of history, History in Motion brings you tales of visionaries and inventors. This episode, we trace the footsteps of a man whose mind buzzed louder than his famed coils, a man ahead of his time, the enigmatic Nikola Tesla. The force behind alternating current, wireless communication dreams, and countless other innovations, Tesla painted a world not just with ideas, but with relentless dedication to a future he so vividly imagined. Venture with us as we journey through the electrifying highs and lows of his life, a life that still resonates in every plug socket and every radio wave. An inventor, a visionary, a legend. This is History in Motion.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today it's a big deal for us, Ritchie. This is the first ever leader that we've been requested by a listener to look into. So I think that's definitely a first for us. So I'm really excited today to talk about the great leader of science, industry, and everything electricity, and that's the great Nikola Tesla.
Yeah, you're right. This is a special episode.
It's a big one.
Had a fan request, so this is pretty awesome. Yeah, I'm actually pretty excited to do this. It's been on the backlog for, I think, quite some time. So, we're finally here. We had this request come in a while ago, and finally we had the time to kind of action.
Yeah, I think it's going to be super interesting because we've done a few different scientists up to this point, and they've all had their hands in industry in some capacity. And it's interesting to just see where Tesla kind of comes into all this. And I'm going to be really interested to see where our conversation goes as we start to compare him to Oppenheimer and von Braun and some of the other folks that we looked at. So yeah, it'll be pretty interesting to see there. But I don't know, do you have any kind of preconceptions that was coming into this about Tesla? Like, I always thought of like the mad scientist was always the first thing that I knew, but I'm curious if you had anything similar.
Yeah, I think in terms of preconceptions, a couple of things. You just touched on one. The first being having, it's actually interesting that you brought up that we've looked at a few scientists. And I kind of just look at them as historical figures. It's just kind of how I approach it. But as soon as you said that, I'm like, yeah, there's some parallels across the people that we've spoken about who, fall into the kind of the not evil, sorry, I shouldn't use that word, but like mad scientist kind of caricature. They're super obsessive. They're extremely intelligent, and they're driven by this thirst of knowledge that is essentially unquenchable. And I think Tesla kind of falls into that. I had an inkling that might be the case, but I didn't necessarily go full into it. I was a little aware of Tesla and his history and, with his relationship with Edison, but it was nothing that really gave me, a lot of background in his life.
Yeah, it's interesting to see kind of those parallels as they come up. And I think, yeah, the mad scientist stuff, I guess they're all a little mad in some capacity to be able to be as smart as they are and accomplish the things that they've done. We look at someone like von Braun, it's, he's rubbing shoulders with Nazis, and Oppenheimer just being sometimes a pretty terrible person and asking people's wives to go to Mexico with them and stuff like, things like that, where there's part of, what we would consider normal for, a regular person that kind of just doesn't seem to sit with them. But part of that is why they're so brilliant. They're able to see things differently that other people don't see. But I'm sure we'll get into that a lot more as we get into Tesla. But I think, Ritchie, do you want to kind of kick us off and tell us about the man before he makes his way to the United States?
Sure, yeah. So I think a good place to kick off, it'll follow a pretty, traditional trajectory for the most part, at least. But so Nikola Tesla was born on July 10th, 1856 in Smiljan, a village in the Croatian region of the Austrian Empire, which is now modern day Croatia. So he was one of 5 children. He grew up in a Serbian Orthodox family. His father was Milutin Tesla, who was a priest, and his mother, Georgina Duca Tesla, was a stay-at-home mom, but she's quite an ingenious and clever woman that, based on his autobiography and what I found out about him, really did play a pretty massive role in his life and the impact that she had made. So I think it might be interesting to kind of talk about his parents quickly. So his father did have an influence on him, like most parents do, but I don't necessarily think it was the influence that he was looking for. So he was an Orthodox priest and a writer. He was a super well-educated person. He had a very vast personal library. He was known to have a powerful memory, and he could recite long passages of biblical text and literature. What a skill that is. In terms of like influence and impact, I think his parents have this interesting dichotomy when I was looking into it. So I think his dad's knowledge and passion for literature obviously influenced Nikola. He ended up writing his own book. He wrote a series of articles. The book is actually, or his autobiography is actually an aggregation of those articles that he wrote. He's obviously very creative and imaginative, but his desire for Nikola wasn't necessarily to be an inventor or a scientist. He wanted him to follow in his footsteps and join the priesthood. However, after witnessing his son's intense passion and aptitude for science and invention, he kind of started supporting him because he knew, those faculties would be better served like pursuing higher education. His mom is actually super, super interesting too. So a lot of historians, and he talks a lot about his mom in his autobiography, not so much his dad. So his relationship with his mom was, according to most historians and based on what I read, had probably one of the most profound impacts across his life. So she was actually born an Orthodox Christian in modern Croatia as well, but she lacked a formal education, but she had a knack for inventing household appliances. So this kind of creative genius aspect to her that, Tesla was kind of aware of from very early on. And he, as he got older, he actually ended up crediting his inventive intuition and photographic memories to his mother's side of the family. He held his mom's side of the family to a very high regard. Apparently, she was the descendant of one of the longest reigning families, like in terms of lineage in Croatia at the time. She was, so I guess like in terms of relationship, they were very, very close, and she was actually highly supportive of his education aspirations from the get-go. She didn't necessarily see him being a priest or ever think that was the right calling for him. He spoke multiple times about how much his mom inspired him, how she would tell him tales of, epic Serbian poems and history. And even in his autobiography, there's a quote that I can pull up afterwards, how his mother's understanding of poetic description actually helped him visualize his inventions before he would create.
That's very, very cool. And I was kind of just thinking something about how we've seen a lot of leaders, right? And we say they're groomed for greatness. We talked about Lorenzo de' Medici. They knew right away he was the most talented of the children and he was going to lead Florence one day. I almost see this as like an informal, I would say, grooming of someone to become a great scientist or a great leader. But you can just kind of see that everything was kind of set in motion for him to be this great scientist based on what he was seeing with his mother. And he kind of has that mix of the artistic side, which you need, I think, to be an inventor, to just think outside the box and think abstractly, but then also just the incredible brain power to do the math and the science and all that behind it. And it's interesting because if you were to say, how would you design another scientist or a great leader of the scientific world? You would put them in an environment where they can take, some of that stuff in and watch and learn and that kind of stuff. Because I think as we see with a lot of these leaders, like dropping out of university or, not necessarily going through the pure higher education standpoint, there's always that piece of experience and artistic, whatever you want to call it. And it seems like his mother kind of has that, and he's able to get into this environment and then have the support of it, kind of a perfect storm of everything coming together to create what they ended up creating with Tesla.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think like the perfect storm is such a great analogy for it. Because I know a lot of, historians or people who study history kind of fall into this, I think it's called like the teleological trap, where everything kind of looks inevitable. That Tesla, was kind of destined to be the creator that he was just because of his genius. But you can see just, and the reason I doubled down on his parents, because I think it's interesting the profound ways in which a family can influence one's pursuits, one's character, and kind of life trajectory. And in many ways, I think Tesla is obviously, a prime example of that, where his parents, one, not really supportive, would eventually turn to supporting him because he saw his aspirations and abilities, at this particular subject, or his mom just, being super inventive and creative and kind of helping him foster that inventive genius that he's obviously known for.
Yeah. And I think even just going back to perfect storm, I was thinking of, it's a perfect storm, but if you push it in one direction a little bit too far, especially with guys like Tesla, because clearly their brain doesn't work like our brains do. There's something else. But yeah, if you poke it in one direction, maybe a little bit too far, he's too artistic. So he's not maybe as disciplined when it comes to, or he becomes a priest. He's thinking too much about, what else comes to life, and he wants to be like his dad and stuff like that. And yeah, it is a perfect storm, but you're right. There's no inevitability there. It's everything kind of has to work out, and he has to be that type of person. But it's just curious to think of how many people may go through that kind of setup, but just something small in their life changes, and then it just nothing really comes of it when in terms of being a great scientist or whatever their aspirations are.
Yeah, this like imperfect balance that kind of strikes, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because it could have gone either way, which is the beauty of this, right? Like, here we are today talking about him and his inventions and his creativity and, what we can learn from him. So if we kind of move forward from his family life, obviously he's, very inventive. He is, a genius. I think that's a very apt word to describe him. So, as a student, he obviously showed promise very early in subjects like mathematics and physics. He attended the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz. He showed interest in electrical engineering there. Later, he would actually study at the Charles Ferdinand University in Prague, but he didn't actually complete a degree. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, it's kind of like this high burn rate that he approached school with. He went in with this intent to want to just set himself up miles above everybody else. But you can't sprint forever. And I think that's ultimately what he fell victim to a certain degree. Like in his first year, he was an outstanding student. He devoted himself to studying from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m. at night. Like that is how much he cared and wanted to be the best at what he did. But obviously he burnt out. You can't do this forever. It took a massive toll on him. And in second year, he lost his scholarship. And this is when his gambling addiction kind of starts to set in. By his third year, he'd gambled away his entire allowance and tuition money, which, ultimately forced him to leave school. And this is compounded with family troubles. So during his time at Polytechnic, his father dies. This is a huge tragedy for him. And then you kind of compound that with his crippling gambling addiction, his study issues, which obviously, he puts a lot of emphasis and probably use that as a metric to kind of, value himself. And, it made it very challenging to continue.
Yeah, I think I go back to that perfect storm, right? There is something here of, the gambling addiction, and we were talking offline, clearly some level of OCD where he's just so obsessed with something. And it's interesting because it doesn't seem like, he's doing this to prove anything to anybody, maybe like at least from his family's perspective, with just kind of what you were saying about how supportive his mother and father were of kind of what he was doing and understood his genius. But then he's probably just trying to prove it to himself. And again, that studying from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m., you're right. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I just find it interesting how he's kind of teetering on the edge there, and you can see that he kind of falls off kind of at the end. But again, I think I just trying to get inside of his head on, what leads you to be studying all day, all night, and then to the point where you run into gambling issues and all this sort of things at such a young age when you're so kind of bent on just being the best at what you can do, and then essentially potentially throwing it all away for whatever, gambling or whatever else kind of is coming his way. And then obviously tragedy in life is just another thing to throw on top of that, which makes it way, way tougher.
Well, it's interesting you say that, right? This sentiment always comes to mind with, I think, many of the leaders, not all the leaders, but many of the leaders that we've talked about. And it's the sentiment that, it's a very thin line between creativity and insanity. And I think many of the leaders we've talked about with this like really impulsive mindset, who are so focused, often have some skeletons in the closet because they need to reorient or redirect some of this energy in other place to, for some sort of escape. And I think, in the case of we'll get to Edison. In the case of Tesla, this might, I think he's kind of part and parcel with this analysis. And it's hard. Sometimes we don't necessarily associate science with creativity, which I think is actually probably a bit of an intellectual short-sightedness on our part. But having read some of his autobiography, disclaimer, I didn't finish it. The way he talks about invention and science and physics, he talks about it in a very artistic way. Like there is a very artsy kind of approach to how he's articulating, the genius or like, the sensation of inventing something. So he's got this beautiful prose about, inventing stuff. I'm like, that's not typically how you think scientists speak about creating, inventions or, running electrical circuits. It's not like, that's not something we associate it with. But you can see that, he does have a very, very, very creative personality alongside his skill set of, math, physics, and electrical engineering.
Yeah, I think if he didn't have any of that creativity or not as much of it, you probably would have seen him go down the traditional academic route. And he may have been, someone we look up to, some of the great scientists who, discovered a lot of great things, wrote a lot of great papers, influenced a lot of great young scientists, but maybe never necessarily built practical machines like we see with Tesla. So like he has that really nice balance between being so interested in the hard science behind the things that he loves, but then that artistic ability to go in and be an engineer who's not just, taking the things that have already existed and being like, oh, I know how to build a bridge or I know how to build a motor. It's, I'm going to build a better motor because I have the ability to think a little bit differently and look at all of these circuits and things as like a canvas. And I'm going to put them together in a way that, follows the rules of physics, but create something a little bit different and continuously do that every single time, which I think is a very, very interesting way to say. And it's giving me flashbacks to the last couple episodes talking about the Renaissance. And we talk a lot about these Renaissance men who are artists, but they're also engineers and they're also interested in history and all these and trying to bring all these things in. He doesn't have it maybe sense that he's painting pictures, but he's creating something brand new, which for that time, industry is booming. That's where the money is. Yep. And that's kind of where he ends up falling to.
100%. I think he nailed it. I think it's the distinction between theory and practice. I think it's a perfect segue. So if we kind of look back to where he's at right now, his father's passed away. He's dropped out of school at this point, and now he's trying to avoid a draft. So he moved to Maribor to avoid the draft. He was unprepared for the conscription into the Austro-Hungarian army. At that time he worked as a draftman, but he was a resident in Maribor illegally. So, he was actually eventually arrested in prison for not having a residence permit. And after a few weeks, his family was able to kind of secure his release from prison. But effectively, now he has no place to study or work. So with no options on the table, he tries to go back to school to resume his studies, but he failed. He went back to Charles Ferdinand University in Prague. He arrived too late to enroll for the first semester. He couldn't secure like the necessary grades in Greek to get in, which was a required subject at the time. He did actually end up attending lectures, but he didn't receive any grades for the courses. So he would just go sit in on classes, which is very interesting. And then to your point, to go full circle, his focus soon shifts from, formal education, getting in textbook theory to practical experience and innovation. And this is when he begins working in the electrical industry, which essentially paved the way for his move to the United States and then some of his groundbreaking contributions to the field.
So yeah, I think with him kind of making it to the United States, there's, kind of a lot going on with the United States. And I think he's going to have a pretty big impact on all of this. But I think maybe now's a good time that we can bring in, I want to say his mortal enemy, but soon to be adversary. And that's Thomas Edison. So we have to look at where the world is at this point. This is the Civil War is wrapped up. It's been about a couple decades since. And really in the northern United States, there is so much industry that's being created. Like railways are huge. Cities are exploding. There's all this new technology that's coming out. And really the biggest thing is electricity is now something that's more widespread. And so Edison comes up with what may be the greatest invention or most important invention of all time. And that's the incandescent light bulb. So that's the typical light bulb that everybody's used up to maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the one that gets really, really warm if you leave it on too long. But that was the way the world was lit for over 100 years and is for most places still lit today. So this was a huge deal, right? Because before that, it was oil lamps, it was candles. So there's, we hear in history about how many times cities just catch on fire when people are using candles. Yeah. It's not the most safe thing to use, and fire departments everywhere are probably thanking Edison for that. And then oil lamps too. Oil's not probably the most safe thing to use either. So he's created this light bulb. It's amazing. Everyone's like, wow, we can light up anything with this light bulb. But how? How do you get the energy into a light bulb to be able to light it up? So remember, there's no electrical grid at this time. There's no way, there's no power plants. There's no way to just flick a switch and all your lights come on. So the United States needs an electrical grid. They need to somehow do that, but they don't have the technology to do that. So Edison comes up with a company called the Edison Illuminating Company, which he uses his invention, which is direct current. And this is the power that he needs to electrify light bulbs. So he has the patent for light bulbs and the patent for DC. So he has a very, 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 very strong incentive to have DC be the main source of electricity and everybody light their homes with light bulbs, because he essentially will have a monopoly on the entire market. So what he does is he opens his first power station on Pearl Street in New York City in 1882, and he begins serving 59 customers. So we need to think like electricity is not a public utility like it is today. So think about like when you go to buy a house or an apartment, they say, oh yeah, we just need to hook the electricity up, and then, the hydro company bills you for what you need. This is you're going around to different private companies who sell electricity, and they just find a way to get you electricity. So a lot of times you see like just wires going everywhere. Yeah. So thankfully in 1934, the US government said, all right, we're going to regulate this industry, and, people have to share things, and, there'll be a more general grid, and, you don't get the rat's nest of electrical wires that you'd see back then, or in some countries today that are still kind of modernizing their electrical grids. So more and more companies are joining Edison's electrical grid, but our old friends, the oil companies, show up. They always seem to have their hand in everything and have created what I would say is one of the biggest PR battles in industry, maybe of all time, that's still going on today. And that's basically saying, use oil, it's better than electricity, and all these sort of things. Basically, their main argument was, don't use electricity, it's far too dangerous. It's like, if you touch a wire, you could get a shock, or it's going to light things on fire. So this huge PR battle starts. But people liked electricity. It was a lot better than having to go refill your oil lamps or have some sort of generator or whatever you're kind of using to power whatever you're needing to power, whether it's using steam or something else. But there's a really, really big drawback to DC power. It doesn't scale well at all. You need power plants essentially every couple of miles to keep the current flowing. So it can't be transferred over long distances without losing a ton of energy. So think of today, if you look at any city you're in, the power plants are all outside of the city, and then it comes in through electrical wires, and then goes through some transformers and substations, and then it gets to your house. If the world was all powered by DC current, you'd be able to look out the window and probably see a local power plant powering your neighborhood, because it's just not able to transmit over a long distance. So with that, you would need more wires, more plants, more generators, all these sort of things, which makes DC power really, really expensive. It also runs at a constant rate. So if you want to supply different levels of voltage to different parts of, if it's a business or if it's a different house or whatever it might be, you need to have separately installed wires, which again, more cost. So people are starting to realize that like, hey, DC is cool, but it's not really going to scale very well.
Not very efficient.
Exactly. Yes. From a long distance transmission standpoint,
scaling it. Yeah. If
yeah.
You're trying to scale it, like the use case for it is quite difficult.
Precisely. Yeah. So DC ends up, and it's still used widely today. So it's not like this was ever thrown away. DC is much simpler because it just kind of runs at this constant rate. So you'll see it in, like, if you use your phone, that's powered by DC. Your battery is holding your power in DC. Just because it's much simpler to use, it doesn't have to travel over that long distance. Even, for example, a Tesla electric car, all the power is stored in DC, or it comes out as the batteries as direct current, and then it goes through something called an inverter, and then the motors run in AC current. So they still exist today, but when it comes to how do we power the world, AC is going to be the way to go. And the reason for that is alternating current constantly changes, so it's oscillating back and forth in a cyclical manner. This means that the electrons don't move in a consistent direction as they do in DC, where they're flowing just in a straight direction. So this consistent oscillation keeps the voltage high as it's moving, which is the key for long-term distribution. So if you ever looked at a light bulb or electrical outlet and you see anything in hertz, that would be AC current. So that means so if you see something that's 60 hertz, that means the direction of the flow is changing 60 times a second. So it's moving very, very quickly. So we're getting to the point now where they're looking at DC in the 1880s, and they're saying, okay, if we could step the voltage up, we could get it to be really high, and then we could transfer it over long distances. So something called a transformer was created, and we see these all over the world today. But then they ran into the same problem. They would transform voltage or the DC voltage up really high, and then as it traveled, it would start to die off, and then you wouldn't get the power you needed where you needed to go. So the way it ended up working with AC was you could put it up to a really high voltage, transfer it over long distances, and then you could drop the voltage down when it was ready to go in somebody's house. So today, if you look at the electrical grid, power plant is going to put things out in really high voltage. Then it's going to get to the city, and you'll see these little substations around your city or your town, and that's dropping the voltage down so you don't have 20,000 volts coming through your electrical outlet and blowing out your light bulbs. So that's kind of the way that works. And then one of the other things with AC is it just didn't have the cost, right? So like we were saying, you don't need to have as many power plants, you don't need as many wires, all those sort of things. And you could actually use thinner wires too, which was huge because copper is expensive and will continue to be very expensive. So that kind of brought things down. But still at this point, AC is a little bit complicated. They still don't really understand how it works. They understand how it works, but they don't really understand how to make things efficient with AC. They know the technology makes sense, but some work needs to be done. And that's where Tesla makes a huge push to kind of make AC better. And he spends a lot of time working on different patents and doing things with AC. And, he has his places in New York where he's doing a lot of things. So there's a lot of things that Tesla's doing that kind of get him, to be the guy when it comes to new and innovative things in the AC realm.
It's crazy to be the guy of AC.
Yeah, not bad.
Right?
Eh?
Yeah, right. And when you first started speaking, Paul, about I guess just kind of level setting and context of what's going on in the world and where we are with the power grid, I think it's probably very difficult for many of us, including our listeners, to imagine a world where you can't switch on and off a light, let alone the complexity of all that goes into something so seemingly simple behind the scenes. It's quite incredible to think, a world without a power grid.
It's definitely something we take for granted, and I would encourage the listeners to do this. If you just Google the US power grid and just take a look at it, it is one of the most complex. It's just all over the place, because you're right. Anywhere you go, unless you're up on the top of a mountain, you have electricity, and it's coming from somewhere, and someone's going to find a way to get it to you, which is incredible. And it's probably part of the reason why you can see a lot of the countries, especially the United States at this time, they figure out how to get electricity, and there's an explosion of economic activity. And, the US is where it is today, and a lot of countries are, following suit on what they did. So having that backbone of that utility changes everything.
Well, you can see the decision-making process too, right? On behalf of Tesla, not just to, aside from kind of focusing on the effectiveness and efficiency of AC, but the foresight to transition to a country where he knows that's ripe with opportunities for what he wants to do. I think that's a very telling decision, and, a well-made one as well.
Definitely. And I think, he went to France for a little bit before he went to the US, and he was working for an arm of Tesla's company. And then when he moved to the United States, he wanted to get closer to Edison. Sorry, Tesla was working for Edison. We're going to keep making that mistake, I'm sure, as we go along here. Two very different people, but yet kind of so close.
I see that here. Yeah, he moved to Paris to work for the Continental Edison company.
Yes, that was it.
Which was, I guess they focused on installing lighting systems.
Yep.
Across some locations.
Yeah, so when he comes to the United States, one of the first things Edison puts him on is I think it was a boat that was running off of had some Edison generators in there, and he went in and spent, like he did, probably from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m. working, or I guess the other way around, 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. That would be only 4-hour shift, and then he's gone, working to kind of get those up and running, and really showing to Edison that he's got this talent and this knack for electrical systems, and he knows Edison systems really well. So he's, Edison does start to see the value of, hey, this guy knows a lot, and let me bring him closer to me, and let's see if he can help improve my systems.
Well, even before that, so this is it's like the 7 degrees of separation. So at the Continental Edison company is where he met and began working under Charles Batchelor, who was actually a close associate of Thomas Edison. They were friends. And Batchelor recognized Tesla's extraordinary talents and abilities, and the two kind of developed this professional rapport. So when Tesla had expressed interest about relocating to the US, Batchelor provided him with a letter of recommendation to Edison. And like, it's a pretty famous letter, that apparently reads, "I know two great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man."
Wow. That's pretty crazy, because especially if you're working with Edison, who's clearly got some ego problems, being able to say that, like, hey, this guy's on your level is pretty crazy. And I find it funny too, just like back then, there's probably like 20 people who really know how electricity works, like for real. And so all you got to do is meet one of them and you'll find your way to Edison. So it's not even 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon or 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, whatever that is. But it's just, if you meet one of these guys and you can prove yourself to one of them, you're going to get into that inner circle.
Well, I think that just like adds this another layer of mythology, of this rivalry.
It does.
You know what I mean? Like when I read that, it kind of just enhanced the research for this episode, because it really just galvanized this, these two behemoths kind of going at it, of massive intellectual capacity for, Batchelor to say that about both.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And I think, the listeners might be thinking, well, okay, we have Edison and Tesla, they're working together, they're recognizing each other's talents. What happens, right? So what happens is Tesla goes to Edison and basically, actually, I think even before that, there's an agreement between Edison tells Tesla that, hey, if you're able to improve my generators in a certain way, I'll give you, it's in the tens of thousands of dollars and some royalties from everything that you've done. And so remember, this is late 1800s, $10,000 it's a good chunk of change, right? And so Tesla spends months working on these projects and goes to Edison, and the way the story goes is basically Edison like laughs it off and says, "Oh, I wasn't actually going to do that. You're just my employee." And I think he was getting paid $14 a week or $15 a week, something like that comes to mind. And Tesla was like, "Oh yeah," I was just like, "That's just an old American joke." And so either there is a cultural difference where he maybe was legitimately just joking, but also for Tesla to take that and work hard for 3 months and Edison, not do anything or stop him or say anything, goes to the character of Edison that, he's a bit of a, and he probably felt threatened too, just based on how brilliant we know Tesla is. And, there's this guy who's able to come in and do things that maybe Edison isn't able to do. He's not really coming in with that, business owner mindset of, hey, I have something great and I'm going to turn it into something even greater by bringing in smart people. It's like, no, I'm the one that did that. My name's on the sign, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with that analysis. Having kind of spun through his autobiography, you can tell that his aspirations aren't necessarily to make a lot of money. I think, he's motivated by something greater than himself, right? Not to say business isn't good, but, when we look at Oppenheimer, von Braun, it's their intellectual curiosity and aspirations to create something that is changing, that has an impact on the world for what they assume is, for the better. And I think, Tesla definitely falls into that category.
Without question. There's this love and obsession over their field and it's their passion. And for a lot of these guys, it is their life's work, and they will continue to work on it until the moment that they die. And we'll get into some of the examples with Tesla, and we can see that that's the most important thing. And you're right. When we look at von Braun, he's working with Nazis. He's allowing Jewish slave labor to be used just so he can get his rockets built. Oppenheimer's building a bomb that he struggles with for the rest of his life because the scientific curiosity just can't shake it, right? It's there. It's like, well, what if we were able to do this? And then, try to rationalize, maybe it ends all war and all of these sort of things. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting kind of comparison and we'll see more of it as we go along. So one thing that Tesla does is he goes to Edison and he basically says, hey, like this AC stuff, it's going to be able to fix a lot of your problems. We should work on AC together. Wouldn't this be a great idea? But Edison refused to acknowledge the benefits of AC. We don't know for sure why. It may come down to pride or stubbornness, which I'm sure played a factor, or maybe just like the sunk cost fallacy. Like he's put so much into DC. Why would he spend more time on AC? But he also, there was a lot of the rivals to AC were really scared that you could scale that voltage up really high and that it was very, very dangerous if it wasn't, insulated properly, which was a fact. And so maybe there was some sincere concern there. He's like, this is just not going to fly from a safety perspective and people are going to die. Maybe not. I'm sure it's a combination of all of those, but I think from what we know about Edison, probably deserves his own episode, is that stubbornness, and that he probably invested a little bit too much. And, it's just so funny because we look at Tesla and Edison and they just seem so separate yet so similar, like that obsession and passion for what they do. Yet Tesla's over here being like, hey, I just want to fix stuff and make cool stuff and research and make the world run on stuff that I've worked on. Yeah.
Two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. Great way to put it. And so you see them coming at each other. And so Tesla eventually says, forget this. I'm going to go do my own AC stuff. He goes off. He starts his own little company. He starts working on a bunch of different things when it comes to, electric generators and just really refining that technology. But he doesn't have that industrial experience for one, but he doesn't have money. So he has some inventors, some investors who come and help him out. And he gets to a point where he's doing, pretty well. But then it comes up to a man named Westinghouse. So that's a famous name that you've probably heard of. And he was a railroad tycoon. His company invented this, I think it was one of the signaling systems that the railway used when it was first started. And, you're building a brand new railway, you're going to make a lot of money. So he's got this huge company and he's looking to get into the electricity game. And him and Tesla get together and essentially start working on AC together. But this is where something begins that we call the current wars. So this was really between Edison and Westinghouse, maybe on the surface, but Team Tesla and Team Westinghouse are kind of the same team because Tesla's working so closely with Westinghouse, and it's really an AC versus DC battle. And this is where things get really weird, where it's becoming a full-on fear-mongering smear campaign from Edison's camp towards Westinghouse. So Westinghouse is starting to set up power plants and start selling AC to customers all around the country. And Edison wrote in 1886, he goes, just as certain as death, Westinghouse will kill a customer within 6 months.
Oh, wow.
So he just gets right into it. Yeah. So he's coming out, and I think it's the classic tale of you got to have good PR. And we've talked about this a million times of leaders coming in and saying we need to have great PR. And Tesla's someone who I don't even think has ever even really thought about PR, where Edison is just trying to put it down as best he can. And he's going to something that's, close to everybody. Nobody wants to die or be electrocuted. So he kind of starts with this, and we'll get into, he does not stop. He keeps going. He keeps going. And he keeps going.
And I've read about it. And I know this isn't an Edison episode, so we'll try not to beat this down too much. But when I was doing some research on Tesla, a lot of things came up around how Edison was able to kind of create this massive propaganda machine.
Yep.
That essentially was able to denounce AC and much of Tesla's work, which he tried to obscure, and he was sadly quite effective at doing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we should get into a little bit of the wackiness that Edison came up with, just I think because it's just crazy stories. So eventually, accidental electrocutions would happen due to poorly installed wires. Someone touches a wire and thousands of volts go through their body. But as soon as somebody died from poor installation or something like that, Edison immediately said, well, that's AC. See, I told you it's not safe. People are going to die from this. So he would say direct current was like a river flowing peacefully through the sea, nothing crazy, where alternating current was like a torrent rushing violently. So this kind of like, think of just rapids and water and just there's no control over it. It's just flying through uncontrolled. Yeah. Exactly. So he enlisted the help of an electrical engineer named Harold Brown, and he staged a number of these unbelievably cruel experiments where they would find animals, basically stray dogs, horses, even elephants. They would bring them into these, I guess, for like showrooms, for lack of a better term, and they would hook them up to electrodes and zap them to death and say, look what AC did to this dog. And like everybody, it was like, oh my God, this is unbelievably cruel. And like eventually these were stopped quite quickly. Like a lot of animal rights activists were like, coming in and physically stopping these things. And very quickly people started to realize that, this is not what we need to be doing. And it's just unbelievably cruel and unnecessary. But it goes one step further, where Edison and Brown come up with the idea of, what if we use electricity as a form of capital punishment to kill criminals? Because were rightfully, the governments were like, look, we're hanging people, and that's just not humane in any sense of the imagination. Not that killing someone is humane, but you could probably do it better than strangling them to death.
Yeah.
So they're like, hey, maybe electricity could be used. And Edison comes and he's like, yeah, we should definitely do that. We'll build the electric chair for you. And he goes, but we're going to buy AC.
You're kidding.
From Westinghouse and from Tesla. So we're going to use those generators for the execution. But Westinghouse was like, no, you're not. I don't want anything to do with this. I don't believe in capital punishment. I don't want to start electrocuting people, all this kind of stuff. So at one point, a convicted murderer is sentenced to die in the electric chair. And apparently Westinghouse spent $100,000 of his own money to try to appeal this. And I think it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And he kept saying that this constituted cruel and unusual punishment, which is under the Constitution that you can't do. But eventually it goes through, and it's just an awful, awful state of affairs. So he's put into the electric chair. They turn the volts on. Kind of think of any movie you've seen where someone's in the electric chair, and they're like, okay, he's, hey, it worked. He's dead. And then like they see him start moving again, and someone screams, oh my God, he's alive. And so the warden flips back on the electricity, and like there's like blood coming from his eyes, and like his skin is burning, and it's just this cruel and disgusting thing that's happened. And everybody in the room was like, oh my God, this is unbelievably terrible. But Edison takes it as saying that this guy and anybody else who's been killed by AC current has been Westinghoused. He uses it as a verb. So
that is, and this man has absolutely no moral qualms about
nothing,
just railroading Westinghouse.
Exactly. But let's compare this too, right, to Tesla. Let's bring Tesla in to just do a comparison. So when we look at Tesla and we look at Edison's PR is, I want my name up in lights. I want to destroy my enemies, not by showing how good my system is, but by how poor theirs is. Exactly. Yeah. Tesla, on the other hand, how he shows the greatness of AC and himself is he does science experiments. He's a nerd, right? He goes out, he does lectures where I believe there was one where he put, I think it was up to like 20,000 volts through his body, but he just showed that when electricity passes through you, that's okay. And he just does all these experiments where he's showing that electricity can move through the air. He's created this Tesla coil that's showing all this electricity being thrown into the air, but in a very controlled manner. And this is a form of, I would say entertainment, but also just people are just dazzled by this. They're like, oh my God, this is the most cool thing I've ever seen in my life. And, and it's starting to inspire people to really understand how cool.
You can see it's creative genius coming out, right?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Goes all the way back to, we talked about, he has this artistic element to it, where I think of Edison as someone who's kind of like a hard line in the sand of, I almost think of like the old stereotype as the old kind of American industrialist who's, I'm going to destroy my enemies and all that kind of stuff, where Tesla has this flair to him a little bit and is willing to just kind of do what he needs to do. But I think to kind of wrap up the story of kind of the Westinghouse and even Tesla when it comes to AC is, the Chicago World's Fair is coming up, and there's a contract that goes out, and they want to show the world that United States is the king of electricity. And we want to turn on, I think it was how many, 20,000 lights or something like that. Something crazy like that. And by this point, Edison's DC is dying off. People are realizing that AC is the better of the two systems. So Westinghouse and Tesla have won this contract to light up the Chicago World's Fair, where the president essentially flicks a switch and all these lights come on. And it's all powered by AC, and Tesla's work is seen throughout, this entire World's Fair. And it gets to the point where Edison finally comes to the understanding that I need to embrace AC. I can't, he doesn't necessarily want to do it, but his company is forced to do it. He's running into financial trouble, and there's another company that's working on AC, and they essentially join. And this was kind of interesting. And I was like, oh, I wonder what company that was. Well, it is the General Electric, like the one today, GE. Yeah, so GE really started from Edison's DC company and a Houston-based AC company combining into one, and creating General Electric, and that ended up working out well. But the one thing that Edison didn't like about all of this was it's no longer his name anymore. It's just the General Electric company, and it's not associated with him. And I didn't even know it was associated with him until today. So I'm sure that kind of rubbed him the wrong way. But Tesla is, he's won this battle. Him with Westinghouse's help has won this battle. However, there's one maybe last thing we should touch on, Ritchie. I don't know if you want to maybe talk a bit about everyone knows about Tesla that he died poor and broke, and I'm sitting here thinking, how did he die poor and broke? Yeah, the AC1. What happened?
Did he gamble it all the way?
Yeah, did he gamble it all the way? Right.
Gamble it all. That's and it's sad. I made that assumption, and I stand corrected. Thankfully, I learned. That's why we're here. But yeah, so obviously there's his relationship with Westinghouse, which is pivotal in kind of cementing the superiority of AC. You have multiple examples of it. You have the Columbian Expedition, the Expedition Chicago. You have the Niagara Falls Power Project, which I thought was interesting. So this is a huge achievement for Tesla and Westinghouse. They essentially, support the development of the hydroelectric power plant in Niagara Falls in the late 1890s. Again, just another, check mark under the effectiveness of AC in transmitting electricity over long distances, which is obviously a huge and monumental achievement to solidify AC's dominance over DC in the market for electrical power distribution. However, things take a turn. There's some financial struggles and then in turn some sacrifice that needs to be done. And this, I think, really does speak to the character and chasm of difference between Edison and Tesla. So Westinghouse, faced financial pressure in the late 1890s, in part due to costs associated with acquiring Tesla's patents and defending them against lawsuits. So to help Westinghouse out, Tesla made a pretty legendary decision. He tore up the contract that entitled him to royalty payments for his AC patent, ensuring the financial survival of the Westinghouse.
I think that says it all right there. He could have been unbelievably wealthy, but it didn't matter to him, I don't think. He wanted to light the world up with AC. He wanted to see I don't know if it's an ego thing from his legacy. I'm sure there's some element to that, like, hey, this is my stuff. I've worked on it. I want it to, be the technology, that everybody uses in the world. And maybe it's a bit of a strategic sacrifice to say, hey, like, I'm going to sacrifice some money so Westinghouse can stay in power and, stay in business and do what he can do. But it goes to show what is the goal, right, that he has. And I think I didn't mention at the beginning of the podcast of what the decision we wanted to talk about today was, because I think it didn't want to spoil it. I think this was just a kind of an interesting one. And I think this is like probably the most interesting decision he's had to make, because you throw away millions and millions of dollars because there's a chance that Westinghouse may run into financial trouble, and your technology won't be the one that lives on till today.
Yeah, and I think when I think about this decision and I compare it across our previous episodes with people similar to Tesla, mainly scientists, inventors, creators, I think there's always this element of doing or committing yourself to something that is bigger than you. And with Tesla, that is, I think, a very, very stark reality. Like, I think he is committed to doing something because he really believes in what he's doing is going to help propel the world. And I think this decision really does, kind of get at the heart of that.
Definitely. And I also think, too, he has, I think, a pretty strong respect for Westinghouse, and because he kind of sees him as the man who took what he wanted to do to the next level. And I actually have a quote here that he said later in life about Westinghouse. So this is Tesla saying, George Westinghouse was, in my opinion, the only man on the globe who could take my alternating current system under the circumstances then existing and win the battle against prejudice and money and power. So basically saying he's the only guy that could have taken this, but then also won that PR battle against Edison and all the detractors who wanted to bring them down. And so I think he has a lot of respect for him, and he wants him to do well too. And I think there's some sort of friendship there, more so than just, a business relationship.
And no animals were harmed during the Westinghouse success.
Exactly.
Just another win.
Yeah, exactly. No animals were intentionally murdered, which is probably, it's always something good to have on your resume. Still unbelievable that happened. But one of the things that I came in with this was I'd always heard about Tesla's death laser, and that later in life he went mad and he was talking about, I'm going to create this death laser, and the FBI was looking into it. And of course I look into it, and from what we've seen with Tesla, he's a little out there, he's a little eccentric, he has his ideas, but I don't really think he's a mad scientist at all, actually. And that's why I always thought he was this mad scientist, because of these death lasers. So there was an article and some things that were Tesla was quoted, I think it was in the New York Post and a few other newspapers, saying that he was working on this death laser in the 30s. And so, he was eventually asked about this, and he's on the record saying, I'm not building a death laser. That doesn't make any sense. So he created something, or he was designing something he called Teleforce, which would accelerate pellets or slugs of material to a high velocity inside a vacuum chamber using electrostatic repulsion, and then fired out of a nozzle intended at target. So he talked about like, hey, it would have been great. If, it's funny how he's able to foreshadow this. He's like, I see it going in London and protecting London against aerial bombardment and stuff like that, because he sees that, the airplane is becoming a thing and he sees that it's going to be involved in warfare. So it's like, wouldn't it be great if cities had all of these around them and they could start shooting down planes that were trying to attack them? Not bad, eh?
Not bad.
So he goes to say about the death laser. And so the idea with this death laser, people were saying, was he's going to take his electricity, concentrate it into a really high concentration and just zap somebody with it. And they would blow up into smoke or something that you would kind of see in cartoons. But Tesla's on the record of saying, if I took all the energy of New York City, which is approximately 2 million horsepower, transformed it into rays, projected at 20 miles, it would not kill a single human being, because according to the well-known laws of physics, it would disperse to such an extent to be ineffectual. My apparatus projects particles, not energy. So he's like, stop this nonsense. I'm not building that. I'm trying to build essentially a particle accelerator. And if we look today at a lot of the systems that are used to do physics research, like we have in France and in Switzerland at the Large Hadron Collider, what do you think they're using to smash these atoms together? They're using large magnets, electrostatic forces. So Tesla understands the science. He knows what he's trying to do here.
Sure,
I think there is some things that the military's even worked on, like these, I think they call them like rail guns or something like that really concentrate in the way that kind of Tesla was talking about, concentrate energy into a really small space using magnetism and some electrical forces, and then propelling something out of a nozzle. Very expensive and require a lot of energy, but Tesla was onto something. He wasn't just thinking crazy and doing his evil scientist laugh with his crazy hair and whatever else you want to think about.
I think there was a bit of a rumor mill around him. So like in his later life, and I know we kind of were beating around the bush with this, but he did face financial difficulties, right? Obviously he gave up what I imagine through his royalties would have been a king's ransom of money by tearing up the contract. But he also spent most of his money on very ambitious projects that didn't always work out. I believe one's called like the Wardenclyffe Tower in New York. It was intended to be a global communication system, but didn't end up happening. And I think the rumor mill around his design and invention of weapons he believed could end world wars was at a period in his life where he was extremely reclusive. He was seen living in New York hotels and feeding pigeons at local parks. So you can kind of see how people are like, oh, what's this? He very much is now this kind of recluse mad scientist. So I can see like, the opportunity for journalists and commentators to kind of use that as a way to spur discussion around what he could be working.
Yeah. And I think too, this is like mass media is really coming to the forefront for the first time, right? So they got to write about something, and everyone loves a little bit of gossip, right? And we've seen it on many episodes where gossip about the royals and different leaders are always top of mind for people. And Tesla's a famous guy, right? So yeah, you're definitely going to get that kind of happening. And I think it's interesting. You talked there a little bit about his maybe more ambitious inventions that don't come to anything. I find it really interesting. We see with a lot of scientists is either they think something's not practically possible and just assume it's never going to happen, or you have someone like Tesla who he thinks he can do it today, but the technology is maybe 100 years away before he can do it. Like a lot of the stuff he did with wireless technology, parts of it is integrated into Wi-Fi and cellular technology today, but back then you're still really far away from being able to do that. And there was even an example I remember reading about Albert Einstein. He talked about how his theory of relativity and the way gravity would distort light. And he was basically saying there was something in the universe where if like a planet was in front of a star, the light would bend around the planet and you would actually be able to see a star that's behind a planet. But Einstein was just like, you know what? Yeah, we'll never be able to do that because it's going to require, a satellite that can, take a little bit of light and do all these sort of things. And they ended up doing it, I think, like 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And he was like, yeah, that'll never happen. But, in theory, this is what will happen. And so I find it's just that line between some scientists who maybe live in that theoretical world and don't have maybe that ambition from a practical perspective, where we can see Tesla, he's got the ambition, but yeah, just maybe later in life,
He's willing to execute.
Yeah.
Right. He's willing to execute, which is incredible. And even if there's the chance that it fails or doesn't pan out, I admire that trait, to be willing to try to create something, knowing he obviously knew there was going to be limitation in the things that he was trying to do.
100%. He could have gone to, I think, like, you have to think of where his priorities are. He could have easily gone and continued to work for Westinghouse, or any of these major electrical companies around the world would have paid him an arm and a leg to have him help build their systems, right? But he's like, no, I'm going to build these crazy different things that probably won't, maybe not work, but I'm going to learn a lot along the way, and I'm going to be able to write about all the different things that I've discovered and be a huge impact on a variety of different things. But, and then feed the pigeons at lunch. Like, that's just the life he wanted to live. How can we fault the guy, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think, just to wrap up on legacy, I'm really fascinated, I think, by Tesla, and just, I think he is different, I think, than the traditional scientists we've looked at, like Oppenheimer, going through that, coming from a rich family, going through that very traditional, stages of education. Even von Braun coming from money and kind of being in bed with the Nazis and having their power behind him. And then
Edison too.
Right? For sure.
He followed a very traditional educational path, but believe he came from pretty good beginnings with his family. He had support much of the.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tesla's the classic self-made man, living the American dream, immigrant, building his way up and, living that dream. So yeah, I think it's a testament to him as a person, the family that he grew up in, kind of teaching him the values. And then I think whatever influence in his life, I think early on that we saw that pushed him in the wrong way, whatever was able to bring him back, I don't think will ever know what exactly that was, but I think that's maybe where I see some of the most fascinating parts of his life, because then, getting to America, it was, whatever he needs to do, and away he went. So I don't think he would ever think one of the biggest car companies in the world would be named after him. And I think that's, I think Elon did well there. And if he's going to pick anybody, he didn't call it the Edison. So I think I think who called her, Elizabeth Holmes, the one who did Theranos, she called her fake box that ended up being a big scam and Edison. So I think it is very funny when you look at the two. She created the Edison, ended up being a big scam to Tesla. Funny. Yeah. Who knows? Yeah. I think it goes to show a little bit, like, do you know your history and maybe who you look up to as a person? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I would agree with the sentiment. I think his legacy is astounding. I definitely think it only kind of entrenched my belief in seeing him as like one of the most influential scientists, inventors of all time. And I almost see him, as this titan of industry, like just on the cusp of it. He's right there. But, because of sacrifices, because of how things worked out, I don't think most people see him as that. And I don't know if that's fair historically, because history isn't always kind to people. And this might be one of those examples in my mind where history is unjustly unkind to Tesla.
I think so, yeah. And I think there's no Westinghouse without Tesla. There may not be Edison to the extent that he is without Tesla. There's probably no GE without Tesla, because, he told everybody AC's the best and we should go do it, and allowed it to get to that point. And yeah, I think he is that titan of industry, and he found himself in a world where, finding the right people kind of brought him to that place. And yeah, I think people maybe just, when I think of him, right, was the kind of the later years of, he did some stuff with AC and then he went off and did crazy stuff. But yeah, there's a lot more to that. And, we can throw industrialist in there a little bit too, I think, because,
let's throw that word in there.
Let's do it. All right. Our unofficial taglines for Tesla here: industrialist, scientist, engineer, and maybe a little bit of mad scientist. But I think it's the perfect amount. So yeah, hats off to Tesla. And I think, he's someone we'll probably have to come back to again one day, and it'll be something I'll be kind of on the lookout for on, when we start to look at other scientists and how they relate to Tesla, or if they come later in life, how Tesla influenced them and, help them do whatever they need to do. So yeah, I think this was a good one, and we'll see where our next scientist takes us.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.